The committee will come to order. Earlier this week, the committee heard testimony about the serious threat posed by domestic terrorism and the impact it has on communities all across our country. Today, we'll continue to examine this grave national security threat and hear from experts representing community as well as research organizations, as well as former government officials about the evolving nature of this threat and how the federal government can better address it. The information we gather from these two hearings will lay important groundwork for a September hearing with current government officials, including FBI Director Wray and DHS Secretary Mayorkas, about what actions our federal agencies are taking to deal with the rising threat of domestic terrorism. I'd like to thank each of our witnesses for joining us today and for their work in the public and private sectors to protect the American people. I look forward to hearing your analysis of rising domestic extremism and your recommendations to ensure we are effectively tackling this deadly threat. On Tuesday, we heard examples of horrific attacks and the roots of that violence from faith-based civil rights, academic, and policy research organizations. The witnesses discussed how this rising violence has affected Asian Americans, Black, Latino, Arab American, and so many other communities, as well as the disturbing rise in anti-Semitic and other faith-based violence. The testimony we heard made it crystal clear that too many Americans are living under the threat of terror, intimidation, physical violence, and that should cause concern for every American. We also heard testimony about the role social media has played in amplifying and spreading hateful rhetoric and misinformation that contributes to increased violent attacks motivated by ethnicity, race, religion, and politics. I look forward to building on that testimony today and continuing to dig into what domestic terrorism data the federal government tracks, whether we should be examining additional authorities, and how we can establish enduring federal policies that will put an end to the violence that is terrorizing our communities. With that, I would normally turn it over to Ranking Member Portman for his opening statements, but he is engaged right now in some negotiations related to the infrastructure bill that is before us in the Senate. In fact, we'll have additional votes on that legislation coming up approximately 11:30. I expect Ranking Member Portman to join us, and he'll be making his comments at that time. But we will move on to hear from our witnesses. As you can see, we'll have members coming in as well. It's a very, very busy. Senator Hassan is here promptly, as she always is, and Senator Portman has now arrived. So right on cue. But we will see members coming in and out given all that is happening. Well, Ranking Member Portman, thank you for being here. I just mentioned how busy you are running every which way and on this infrastructure package, which we appreciate, but thank you for being here, and we welcome your opening comments.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Peters. And appreciate your holding this hearing and continuing our discussion, which we began on Tuesday, about the persistent threat of domestic terrorism and violent extremism. As I said earlier this week, these threats are affecting communities all across our country, and I want to be sure that as we go through these hearings, we recognize that. They transcend racial, ethnic, and religious lines, and as we heard on Tuesday, significantly increased threats against members of law enforcement, the military, and government. In fact, that was based on the data that had been compiled that we heard about on Tuesday. That was where most of the actual threats and acts had been committed. So we have a problem, and the internet, as Senator Hassan and a lot of our experts pointed out, has exacerbated the problem, both in terms of spreading disinformation and creating some of the conditions for violent extremism, but also in terms of organizing some of the hateful acts. On Tuesday, the witnesses highlighted many important points we will discuss today, including that virtually all domestic terrorists, inspired by a range of these ideological beliefs on the right and left, do use the internet and social media platforms to release propaganda, coordinate training, raise funds, recruit members, and incite violence here at home. The administration must be more transparent and provide the necessary data for us to have a comprehensive understanding of the current threat landscape. That's something that was talked about a lot by all groups, is information, data, having the facts. Going forward, we need to talk about solutions and areas where more congressional action is needed to address these threats effectively. I think that was a conclusion. I think today we'll talk more about solutions, which I think is very helpful. I also appreciated the multiple witnesses on Tuesday testified that the Homeland Security's Nonprofit Security Grant Program has been helpful to nonprofits who have applied for funds they can use to secure their facilities. We have worked hard in this committee to authorize that program, to expand it. We're pleased that we were able to get a authorization signed into law last year. The data shows that despite the expansion of this program, there are many states that are not taking full advantage of it and the tools that it provides. So we're committed to ensuring that those states, nonprofits, religious institutions are not just aware of the program, but using it to utilize it to protect themselves from the increasing threats. I was also pleased to hear witnesses express on Tuesday support for the Pray Safe Act that I authored and introduced with Senator Hassan, who's here this morning. This is the legislation that creates the federal clearinghouse that I think is as important, maybe more important than the funding, is to be sure people have access to information on safety, on best practices in the security realm, available federal grant programs, including the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, and training opportunities. I hope we can get that legislation passed. It's already been reported out of this committee. That said, it's clear that more does need to be done. Determining what solutions and tools are needed requires us to hear not just from the private entities, but of course from federal officials, current federal officials responsible for understanding and addressing these threats. Next month, the committee is planning its annual threats hearing at which I expect domestic terrorism and violent extremism will play a significant role. Hearing from government officials on what the administration is doing to combat these threats, I think, is something that is overdue, and I hope we'll hear from them. In the interim, I'm pleased that today we'll be hearing from a former government official, in addition to subject matter experts and some of the community leaders being most affected by these threats. I appreciate the witnesses being here today. I look forward to hearing their testimony and particularly your recommendations on how Congress can do a better job in responding to these efforts and improve our federal efforts to combat terrorism and violent extremism in this country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Portman. It's the practice of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee to swear in witnesses. So if each of you will stand and raise your right hand, including those online. Do you swear that the testimony that you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
The witnesses have all answered affirmatively. You may be seated. Our first witness today is Ms. Elizabeth Neumann, the former Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention at the Department of Homeland Security, and who currently serves as the Chief Strategy Officer at Moonshot, a web-based organization that utilizes data to mitigate the effects of harmful online content to vulnerable populations. Ms. Neumann has years of experience in protecting our homeland, most notably her time at DHS, where she oversaw department-wide policy development and implementation involving terrorism prevention and countering transnational terrorism. Welcome, Ms. Neumann. You are recognized for your 5-minute opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Chairman Peters. Also to Ranking Member Portman, Senator Hassan, and the other distinguished members of the committee. I'm very pleased that you're holding this hearing today. I'm very thankful that you are continuing to stay engaged on this topic and appreciate your leadership and commitment to this challenge. The timing of this hearing prompts me to reflect on the spate of attacks that we had 2 years ago this week. It was Gilroy, El Paso, and Dayton. Those few days in 2019 served to foreshadow in many ways the current spike of violence that started last summer and continues this year. In particular, that there is no singular ideology or grievance responsible for all of the attacks we have seen. We have some attacks targeted at institutions, including law enforcement. We have some attacks that are targeted at people groups, particularly those that historically have been marginalized. Others are ideologically motivated, or what we would consider terrorism, and still others, we have motives that aren't determined. Tuesday's panel spoke extensively about the importance of the protection mission, which is critical when you're talking about combating domestic violent extremism. But today I want to take a look back at the progress we've made over the past 2 years in implementing a prevention strategy. even while I will acknowledge today we have a long way to go. I briefed this committee in October 2019 about our then new prevention strategy, which is contained in the Strategic Framework to Counterterrorism and Targeted Violence. The goal was to partner with our state and local governments to build prevention frameworks which would help first build resilience in individuals that are vulnerable to radicalization. These are individuals that are not radicalized yet but have factors in their life that make them vulnerable. And two, for those that have radicalized, to attempt to help them find healthier ways to address their grievances or problems before they cross a criminal threshold. El Paso, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, the Nashville Christmas bombing, and the recent shooting at the Indianapolis FedEx facility all had a common feature that there was a bystander that reported to law enforcement that they had concerns. And law enforcement, after the fact, said, yes, we had concerns about that individual, but we did not have the probable cause or the tools to be able to do anything. We need to find a way to get help to those individuals before they cross that criminal threshold. Building local prevention frameworks will allow bystanders, the neighbors, colleagues, friends, and loved ones that notice something is wrong to consult with experts before they have concerns, before an individual has committed a criminal act. And that's the linchpin of what we describe when we're talking about prevention. I'm very pleased that the Biden administration not only has taken the threat of domestic terrorism very seriously, but they have also continued to implement our prevention strategy. That said, the hardest part is always implementation. It doesn't matter who the president is or which party is in power. Launching new programs in government is challenging, and then you add to it COVID and a presidential transition period. It predictably and understandably slows progress. In addition, the state and local partners that we're supposed to be building these capabilities with are facing significant budget shortfalls due to COVID. All of these things have served to slow progress, but I do hope that we can talk about some ways to build some momentum. The first thing that I would encourage this committee to consider is to authorize the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships at DHS. We've discussed this with you in the past. I think the time is right. We know that the new administration is endorsing this approach, and authorizing, though it might just seem like a simple thing, it actually does have an impact in removing distractions within the bureaucracy, relitigating the mission. It allows the team there to just move forward with their mission. Second, I would encourage a discussion to happen about finding a permanent home for the center. When we established what was then called the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention, it was with the intent that we knew we would likely need to incubate it at the Office of Policy and then move it to the appropriate location. In order to do that, I would encourage you to confirm the Undersecretary for Policy nominee, Robert Silvers, this week, and upon his confirmation, I would encourage a robust discussion between DHS and the oversight committees about where to place the center in DHS so that it can perform its mission. Lastly, I would say that the initial funding provided by Congress for the center and for the grants was an excellent start, but it is time to scale our resources. The 2019 RAND study that was the basis for our prevention strategy includes an entire chapter assessing resourcing needs, which I'll summarize, borrowing Benjamin Franklin's famous phrase, "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." I recommend scaling grants for the current 20 million, from the current 20 million to over 200 million over a multi-year period, and I recommend that Congress authorize 50 prevention coordinators to be placed in every state next year and increase beyond that after a workforce assessment is completed. Additional explanations and justifications for these recommendations can be found in my written statement. In closing, I don't believe I'm overstating the extreme challenge the security community faces at this time. The pandemic increased social isolation and other stress factors that are known to increase radicalization. It is likely part of the reason why we are seeing significant spikes in violence. The country is polarized. I don't have to tell you this. Our discourse is routinely dehumanizing people that hold opposing views. And I'm particularly concerned about the growth of accelerationism, a belief that individual actors should conduct attacks to help accelerate societal collapse. My concern in particular is that I'm seeing threads of this doctrine discussed in the political mainstream. Acceleration is fundamentally anti-democratic, and it's extremely dangerous. The current scope of violent extremism in our country is simply too big for the security community to fix. We must call on other parts of our society to reflect on their contributions to our current moment, and all of us need to work towards a more responsible discourse that allows for disagreement without dehumanizing our opponents, and we must always strongly and quickly condemn anyone that suggests violence is somehow justified to achieve one's goals. Where and how do we start? This almost sounds too simple, but the research has borne it out repeatedly. We start locally. We start with our families and with our neighbors. The greatest disruption to the grievance cycle that leads to violence begins by loving our neighbor as we'd like to be loved ourselves. Thank you for your time and your leadership. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Neumann. Our second witness is Ms. Maya Berry. She is the executive director of the Arab American Institute, a national civil rights nonprofit organization that promotes civic engagement and legislative advocacy on behalf of the 3.7 million Arab Americans living in the United States. As executive director, she works to expand Arab Americans Institute's capacity to combat hate crimes and protect the rights of securitized communities. Ms. Berry established AAI's Government Relations Department and, I may proudly say, as a Michigan native, also served as legislative director for U.S. House of Representatives Minority Whip David Bonnier. During her time at Capitol Hill, she managed legislative strategy with a focus on human rights, immigration, civil rights, and liberties and trade. Welcome, Ms. Berry. You are now recognized for your 5-minute opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Portman, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for convening today's hearing. August is a difficult time for many communities. This week, it was the 2-year anniversary of the El Paso shooting. Next week marks the anniversary of the hate crime murders of Khalid Jabara and Heather Heyer, of whom a recent law is named after. And today marks the 9th year since the shooting at the Sikh Gurdwara in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. I'd like to begin by my testimony by saying the names of those who died on this day 9 years ago. Satwant Singh Kalaka, Parmjot Kawar, Savik Singh Kastara, Parkash Singh, Ranjit Singh, Sita Singh, and just last March, Baba Punjab Singh, who was wounded during the attack, died from his injuries. These names, of course, don't include the victims injured, including Lieutenant Brian Murphy, who was shot 15 times while defending those inside the Gurdwara. I believe it's important to center victims and communities in these conversations, and I thank you for including the perspective of the Arab American community, one targeted not just by ethnically motivated violence, but a community that experiences the harms of profiling and expansive and often overly broad counterterrorism programs and policies. It is in that context that I want to emphasize 3 points that I hope inform our discussion today, beyond what I provide in my written testimony. First, I believe it is imperative that we have a shared understanding of the threat we face. Attorney General Merrick Garland, Homeland Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, and FBI Director Christopher Wray have all testified before you with complete clarity. White supremacist violence poses the most lethal threat to our safety. It may be characterized under a new category of, quote, racially motivated violence, but we are talking about violence inspired by white supremacy. Even before the recently joint FBI-DH document on domestic terrorism provided some analysis, an FBI official in a letter in May of 2020 to Chairman Benny Thompson stated that as recently as the first quarter of fiscal year 2020, approximately half of the FBI's domestic terrorism disruptions, quote unquote, were arrests of racially motivated violent extremism, but all but one being white supremacist violence. Our work has often centered around the need for better data for both hate crimes and domestic terrorism investigations and prosecutions. We must have accurate data on the nature and extent of white supremacist violence and the political will to change both the policies and practices that have generally overlooked its growth. And to be clear, the scarcity of public data does not stem from a lack of relevant legal authority, which gets me to my second point. As we go after white supremacist violence, we must not take an approach that could harm some of the very communities we need to protect from this violence. We do not believe that we need a new charge of domestic terrorism. Indeed, instead of expanding potentially harmful counterterrorism policies in a yet untransformed criminal justice system, Congress should act to provide additional oversight to safeguard the rights of individuals and communities. The considerations of policy and legal responses to acts of white supremacist violence, which, depending on the specific circumstances, might also fall in with the definition of a hate crime, are made exceedingly fragile by the fact that Americans' constitutional rights hang in the balance. Finally, the public discourse on these issues matters. Speaking out against hate and bigotry makes a difference. We must isolate this hatred that fuels this violence. We must shame it. And hearing it or excusing it for it emanating from elected officials, including the presidential bully pulpit, did extraordinary harm to all of us. While I'm not suggesting there is a direct correlation, even the universally accepted underreporting of the federal hate crime statistics showed an increase in hate crime in the lead up to the 2016 presidential campaign and during the Trump administration. Words have consequences. We saw it in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, where then President Bush stood up and said, do not scapegoat an entire community. We saw the different impact after these most recent incidents. And back to where we started. Every single data point is a person, a family, a community. It is a core belief of the Arab American Institute that for our country to live up to its ideals, we must ensure strong and civil rights and civil liberties protections for all. I hope our deliberations today move us in the direction of enhancing the safety of all communities, especially the most vulnerable to this violence, while protecting the rights of all. Thank you again for your oversight convening this hearing today.
Well, thank you, Ms. Berry. Our third witness is Mr. Jonathan Greenblatt, CEO and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League, an organization committed to stopping the defamation of Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. During his tenure at ADL, he has worked to modernize ADL's operations and enhance its ability to counter hate crimes. Mr. Greenblatt oversees ADL's Center on Extremism, which analyzes and monitors extremist and hate groups, launched Never Is Now, the world's largest summit focused on anti-Semitism and hate, and created the Center for Technology and Society, which targets the rising tide of online hate and harassment. Prior to joining ADL, Mr. Greenblatt served as Special Assistant to President Obama and Director of the Office of Social Innovation. Mr. Greenblatt, welcome to the committee. You may proceed with your opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Portman, members of the committee, and my fellow panelists, good morning. It's an honor to appear before you today to address the dire threat posed to this country by domestic terrorism and violent extremism. For more than a century, ADL has worked to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. To deliver on that mission, we've done many things, including assemble a world-class team investigating extremist threats from across the ideological spectrum. And unfortunately, those threats are on the rise. At the top of the pyramid of hate are the most extreme incidents, like what happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh almost 3 years ago. The massacre of Latinos in El Paso, Texas, that took place 2 years ago this week. The murder of Heather Heyer at the neo-Nazi rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, 4 years ago next week. The Pulse nightclub shooting against the LGBTQ community just over 5 years ago in Orlando, Florida. And as previously been noted, the attack on the Sikh Gurdwara in Oak Brook, Wisconsin that happened 9 years ago today. Over the last decade, 429 innocent victims were murdered at the hands of extremists, the overwhelming majority of whom were far right extremists and white supremacists. But we also know full well that you don't have to be an official card-carrying extremist to cause harm. The problem we see is that violence motivated by hate and anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry increasingly has been normalized. ADL researchers found that 2020 was the third highest year on record for anti-Semitic incidents since we began tracking this data in the 1970s. Of these, known extremist groups or individuals inspired by extremist ideology were responsible for 16% of the total number of incidents. That's a lot. But as I said, anti-Semitism clearly is not the sole domain of extremists. We saw this past May as the violence between Israel and Hamas escalated, a drastic and disturbing rise in anti-Semitic activity across America, including almost a dozen anti-Semitic assaults in public places like Times Square or in a boulevard in Los Angeles where people are eating dinner, or in a main thoroughfare in Las Vegas, and attacks on Jews simply walking down the street. And this isn't Germany in 1931. We're talking about the United States in the year 2021. But this matters not just because of what's happening to the Jewish community. As I've said before, and I'll say it here again, very often hate might start with the Jews, but it never ends there. Bigotry begets more bigotry. Hate leads to more hate. For example, between March 2020 and this past February, the Asian American and Pacific Islander community experienced nearly 3,800 incidents of hate, 11% of which were physical assaults. And in 2019, the FBI data showed anti-Latino hate crimes rose nearly 9%. So why is the threat on the rise? To boil it down, we believe that this movement has been fueled by two catalysts. The first are leaders who have repeated extremist rhetoric, co-opted their conspiracies, and knowingly or not have given them the green light. And make no mistake, this is coming from some who have had the highest levels of office, and also from people in positions of authority across the ideological spectrum. Neither side is exempt from intolerance. Second, social media. It is a super spreader of hate. You can find it with just a few clicks right from your phone. Intolerance is increased and amplified by algorithms that invisibly induce users further down the rabbit hole of radicalism. It's all unacceptable. We've been urging at ADL, pushing the tech urgency to take meaningful action for years, simply to enforce their own terms of service, but they failed to do so. That's why we've also called on policymakers like you to finally hold them accountable for their role in enabling the spread of extremism. Deep and dramatic reform of Section 230 is essential to this process because the law should not exempt them from accountability from their products and services. The time for action against the extremist threat is now. We need an all-hands-on-deck approach from government and really a whole of society strategy to combating domestic terrorism and violent extremism. That's why ADL has created a framework. We call it the PROTECT Plan, to mitigate these threats while safeguarding civil liberties. There's a lot more detail on this in my written testimony. Happy to speak to it during the question and answer session. But we believe these steps can have an immediate and significant impact in countering domestic terrorism. More so than any single action or policy or law, there is simply no silver bullet. Now, we were glad to see that the administration recently released the first ever national strategy to counter domestic terrorism, which closely actually tracks to our plan. But today I'm here to urge you to do your part in implementing these strategies and to meet the moment. As part of this, you need to rethink DHS for the modern era, making sure it's best prepared and organized to address the threat of domestic terrorism. And I know it's somewhat beyond this committee's jurisdiction, but again, I would implore you to strive for Congress to take serious action against the social media companies. Members of the committee, as you work to address the concerns around domestic terrorism and violent extremism, we urge you to remember that the way these threats tear at the very fabric of our communities and our country. For ultimately, this is not a Democratic problem or a Republican problem. It's an American problem. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Greenblatt. Our next witness is Mr. Brian Levin, a professor of criminal justice and director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, San Bernardino, a nonpartisan independent research and policy institution. As the director of the center, Mr. Levin leads the organization's efforts to examine and analyze hate crimes, terrorism, and legal issues. Mr. Levin is a court-certified expert on extremism in the United States and in England, He is the author of The Limits of Dissent, which is about the Constitution and domestic terrorism. Mr. Levin, welcome to the committee. You may proceed with your opening comments.
Chair Peters, Ranking Member Portman, Senator Hassan, Senator Padilla, California Zone, if I may, and other members of the committee, as well as the heroes of the U.S. Capitol and D.C. Metropolitan Police Departments. And as a former NYPD officer, God bless every one of them. Thank each of you for your service to our nation and for another special opportunity to present some of my latest analysis and findings on hate and extremism, which Congress has used since 1987, when I was 10. I am, as you've heard, with Cal State San Bernardino Center and the Criminal Justice Department there, but my testimony today will address material trends related to the threat posed by racially, religiously, and politically motivated extremism. The extremist threat today, both domestically and internationally, is in a state of significant realignment across several fronts, and it is also severe. As I have noted for several years, white supremacists and far-right extremists continue to pose the most lethal domestic terror threat facing the United States, but they do so in an increasingly diversifying landscape that impacts not only these malefactors, but various emerging actors across the entirety of the extremism spectrum. Indeed, we are seeing an era of a democratization of hate. Recent headlines across North America illustrate this. A 189% spike in anti-Asian hate crime in major U.S. cities that we found in the first quarter of 2021. A diverse group of over 550 defendants in the Capitol siege, violent confrontations at the local level around hot-button issues, including at school board meetings and at congressional hometown conferences. Also, increasing activity of militias of various stripes, bomb plots and hoaxes by incel misogynists, an anti-Semitic attack previously referenced in Times Square, and the emergence of a years-old KKK plot against a black man by Florida corrections officers, just to name a few. And it's occurring elsewhere in North America. In Canada, anti-Asian hate crime also rose amidst another mass homicide against a Muslim family and a spate of church arsons. Well, unfortunately, our 2020 data is not looking good. California, Texas, and New Jersey are up, for example. But the increases vary by location. Extremist homicides, while down, and I think that was a temporary anomaly with respect to the various COVID restrictions, still showed a diversification going on. Indeed, the first hard left homicides we saw were last year. In many years, 2021, New York City up 135%, LA up 53%, just year to date. Anti-Semitic hate crimes up significantly. For instance, in New York City, we saw more anti-Semitic hate crimes, or just about as many, rather, in 3 weeks in May than the whole first quarter. And indeed, New York City and LA look like they may be heading for records. Similarly, anti-Asian hate crimes up triple-digit percentages both last year and the first quarter of this year. 2020, according to the FBI Director Wray, hate crime investigations up 63%, 370 alone, just with the FBI. 2019, record hate homicides by the FBI. And by the way, it would still be a record even without the horrifying El Paso massacre of just 2 years ago. As we've seen with respect to El Paso and others, we're seeing a confluence of folks, mass killers, some very young, who have access to weaponry. There is an overlap between hate crime and terrorism, but we are seeing violent conflict also rising around conflictual political events, which I've documented in the appendix. Indeed, extremism is a carnival mirror reflection of mainstream stressors. And we have seen this again and again and again, not just on January 6th, but in October of 2018 when we saw a cluster of extremist homicides right around the election. August 2017 was the third worst month of the decade for hate crime, and it peaked in the 6 days of and after the very fine people statement by the president. But November 2016 was the worst month for hate crime in 14 years, and the day after the election was the worst month till June 2003. Online invective around this is up too. So we see this feedback loop of invective on the internet, some influential political leaders, and then hate crime rises, and sometimes terrorist plots and attacks around these events, these convergences. I have a litany of suggestions which I'd be happy to talk to later as my time is ending. But I want you to understand that today's terrorist is increasingly less ideological and organizationally rigid. We have an elastic reservoir of grievance, and targeted violence and hate crimes often overlap. So we need data that is timely and deep. And we have not had that in many years. And I hope the Senate acts on these various proposals that I have at the end of my testimony. But again, we are seeing a very disturbing change, and the risk is severe, not just from the leaderless resistance that I warned about to Congress back in 1995, but this dissipation of extremism that is becoming more regional and more idiosyncratic in its manifestations. I want to thank the committee so much for the privilege of once again sharing our important data and highlighting the severe risk that our nation is facing with respect to domestic terrorism. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Ms. Berry, your organization has been at the forefront of protecting the Arab American community and navigating the domestic terrorism threat in the post 9/11 world. You have voiced your opposition to the creation of a new domestic terrorism statute during your opening statement here today, and you noted your concern that additional authorities could potentially adversely impact civil rights and further harm communities of color. So my question to you is, if additional authorities are not the right approach in your estimation, what should the federal government be doing to counter this threat while at the same time balancing civil liberty concerns?
Thank you, Chairman Peters, for the question and the way that you reframed it, because I think that is the key question. The reason we believe that a new charge is not necessary is that there are existing 57 different statutes that apply to crimes that meet the definition of terrorism. Of those, 51 apply to both domestic and international terrorism. So from our perspective, there needs to be a different approach that understands the threat that we face today. I think one of the most important things that's happened, frankly, is the change during the recent election is that we are actually discussing it as the problem that it is. The Biden administration did release a strategy. While there's a lot there to think about and address, and I think congressional oversight will be key to talk about its implementation, the fact that we are now taking it seriously enough for a strategy to be issued is important. The FBI had not released data on domestic terrorism since 2005 until the report that they released recently in May of 21, just this year. So I think we do see an uptick now in what is happening, and that is looking at this threat that is posed and trying to determine how to best address it. I think that 20 years after the horrific attacks of 9/11 is a good time for us to reevaluate what was passed with the Patriot Act, look at the sunset provisions that were put in place, and say, does it make sense for us to sort of double down on the counterterrorism approach that we've taken? I will share with you, Mr. Chairman, that I was doing a press interview once about this very topic, and the reporter kept saying, so I don't understand, you oppose a new charge. And I said, yes, sir, and I explained why. And he came back to, so what you're saying is, doing to white supremacists what was done to your community, that's not something you want? And my answer was, sir, our approach is about dealing with the violence that puts us at risk, our country and all of our communities. I saw a community, both Arab Americans, American Muslims, and others, whose rights were violated under this setup. So from our perspective, no, I don't want other Americans' rights violated. I want the violence addressed. I want a First Amendment protected in that process. I want a Fourth Amendment protected in that process. I want to hold constitutional protections while we go after the very real threat that communities are facing.
Thank you. Ms. Neumann, in your opening comments, you suggested that we do need additional authorities. After listening to Ms. Berry's comments, I mean, I hope you take those in consideration as you answer this question, is why are the government's current tools not enough to combat this threat in your estimation?
Thank you for the question, and I imagine that Ms. Berry and I actually agree on a lot more than where we vary. I too believe 20 years post 9/11, it would be a really great idea for us to reflect. A lot of mistakes were made. In my written remarks, I note that we have more terrorists today than we did on 9/11. That's very sobering as a counterterrorism person. I thank the Lord that we haven't had another 9/11. That is a success that we should all be proud of. But there are some costs to that, and one of those is that I found it really jarring in recent months to hear from people like Ms. Berry and the Brennan Center and other communities. You had panelists on Tuesday who basically said, this is how I interpret it, I don't trust the government to not abuse any new tools we give them. That should cause us all to pause. And I'm not in government right now, but I associate with it, and I think that means that we need to reflect. We didn't get some things right in the last 20 years. So I fully agree that we should reassess. At the same time, I look at the way the law currently treats similar crimes, if done in the name of a white supremacist ideology versus in the name of ISIS. Those crimes are treated differently. Now, my colleagues former colleagues in the government, they are doing their darndest the way the laws are written to go after the threat. They take the threat seriously, and they recognize the perils of what it would look like to try to open up this conversation and talk about changing the law. They recognize that that's very difficult. So they're doing the best they can with the tools that they have. I would think that it would behoove us as a people to have a commission that looks at this problem, looks at our mistakes, updates the law on all sides, not just for domestic terrorism, but we've got to do counterterrorism better. And I think from an equal justice under the law principle, the laws need to be right-sized so that we're treating the same crimes the same, regardless of the ideology. And the second thing I would point out is that domestic terrorism ideologies are increasingly global in nature. And that gray area is posing challenges for our colleagues in the executive branch, trying to know where that line is. Having Congress say, here's where the line is, would be better than them guessing.
Thank you. Mr. Levin, you have warned about political rhetoric from our leaders, noting in a Time magazine article that, and I'm going to quote you here, leaders must be aware of the impact of their position on civic and social cohesion. Otherwise, terrorists will gain strength in the cracks that divide us, end of quote. Could you describe the correlation between political rhetoric and spikes in violent incidents against racial, ethnic, and religious groups to the committee?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for the opportunity. You know, it harkens back to President Lincoln's first inaugural address, where trying to keep a country together, he said, to appeal to the better angels of our nature. And you know what? He was right. He might not have been effective at that time, but his words have sustenance. Let me give you an example. 6 days after 9/11, President Bush, a conservative person of goodwill, went to the Islamic Center of D.C. at 3:40 in the afternoon and decried the violence against our Muslim American brothers and sisters. You know what? Hate crimes dropped precipitously the next day, according to FBI day-by-day ticks. And it dropped precipitously into the new year. We went from 481 to just over 100 in those 2 years. But the very next day and into the next week, conversely, our community was attacked in San Bernardino. Everybody got together. everybody. The Muslim community raised money. We had interfaith. Do you know what? We had 0 hate crimes in the city of San Bernardino, but that wasn't the case for the rest of the country. We saw a significant increase from about 0.67 per day to about 2.5 per day. And then 5 days later, candidate Trump made the terrible proposal of a Muslim ban. And hate crimes against Muslims increased another 23%. Let me just add, by the way, Arabophobic hate crimes went up too in both instances. The issue is words matter, particularly when it's coming from leaders. Interestingly enough, when President Trump launched his campaign and spoke derisively about Latinos, during a very tight news cycle where major candidates were about to launch and we had the Mother Emanuel massacre, hate crimes against Latinos did not go up. But once he became first in the polls and he made statements with respect to various communities, we saw absolute correlations. And we saw it again last year with regard to anti-Asian hate crime. One thing, though, that I think is important to note, we often have a catalytic event, then a feedback loop that is fed online, then certain influencers take this bigotry, and then when you have it from the top, boom. And we saw that in 3 distinct clusters last February and March with anti-Asian hate crime. It's something that we see demonstrably again and again, and I gave you the figures with regard to these election times, a clustering of extremist homicides around the conflictual midterms, as well as an increase in hate crime. Indeed, the first worst month of the decade, November 2016, and the day after was the worst day for hate crime going back to June 2003. Second worst month, October 2018. And then, tied for the third worst month, was August 2017, the month of Charlottesville. But the hate crimes peaked in the 6 days of and after the Very Fine People statement.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Levin. Ranking Member Portman, you are recognized for your questions.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate all the testimony today. Ms. Berry, I understand your view on laws that can be misused. But one thing I just want to be sure that we are connecting the dots on here. This is the committee that's supposed to do the oversight over Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security. And we had a lot of discussion today from Ms. Neumann about what was called the Office for Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention that you were with previously, and now it's called the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships. In your written testimony, you talked about the fact that you thought that was an ineffective and even discriminatory office. You did not talk about that today, and you guys have not had a dialogue on that, maybe on purpose. But again, our job, as I said earlier, if we can get more to solutions in this round of testimony, that would be great. Can you guys have a discussion about that? Like, what's wrong with having an office or a center that focuses on that? And Ms. Neumann, you were there, so I'll let you respond to Ms. Berry. But Ms. Berry, if you could just give me your views on that. What are your current views on that office or the center?
Thank you, Ranking Member Portman, for the question. The comments in my statement refer to programs primarily under the Obama administration and into some of the time under the Trump administration known as countering violent extremism programs. We take a very cautious approach, shall I say, to approaching prevention programs because what we've seen in practice to be primarily ineffective approaches. I didn't take the position of directly opposing in my statement the CP3 programming or the new TVTP. And I'll tell you that, Senator, that's because it's early in the process. We have had 2 briefings. They've talked a great deal about the new Colorado model. I'm interested in hearing more about it. But what we have found historically is there's 2 reasons for us to be concerned. The first is the efficacy of these programs. Frankly, as an American taxpayer, as someone who has concerns about how we spend our tax dollars where those efforts are, and in times when there's great deal for need to appropriately fund good programs. I worry about radicalization theories and the ideas that we can step in and prevent this type of violence. I'll leave that to the experts, but I do think that there's a lot of healthy skepticism about what's possible. The second part of the concern that relates directly to the CVE programming previously, and as I said, we'll cautiously ask for congressional oversight over these programs and look at them, is that they were highly discriminatory in targeting specific communities. We were led to believe that a young American Muslim teenager who was probably going through some issues needed to be, for example, referred to their school counselor on a different track and different oversight. We had the FBI create a website called Don't Be a Puppet that was really problematic for many reasons. There's a lot of the CVE programming that was highly I think irregular and discriminatory. And it didn't stop with targeting the American Muslim community. We went from countering violent extremism to this concept known as BIE, the Black Identity Extremism, which is a completely fabricated issue. So we have real concerns about what prevention programs have looked like and are willing to see where they're going, but the reality is there needs to be a great deal of oversight.
To your response, Ms. Zimmer, because we need to have that, and thanks for doing it in an expedited way because there's so many issues to get into here. It sounds like you're saying we should not reauthorize it or authorize the CP3 program without adequate oversight, but are you saying that we shouldn't authorize it at all? Just yes or no?
At this time, I would say no. Okay.
Ms. Neumann, what is your response to that?
Again, I probably agree with more than people might think of what Ms. Berry said. The early iterations of CVE, there were multiple instances where, in my view, it was abused, that it was at times, and I don't know that those that set it up intended it to be this way, but at times in certain locations in the country, it basically became a tips and leads program for the FBI. And if you know anything about radicalization processes and how you might move somebody to build resilience so that they're not vulnerable to radicalization, or you're trying to move somebody off of a radicalization pathway, inserting law enforcement into that dialogue usually doesn't help. It closes off, and we saw this, right? The communities, the very communities that we needed to be partnering with did not trust the FBI because of other factors that had nothing to do with CVE. You add CVE to the mix, and it just didn't work in multiple locations. There were other places where they piloted efforts, not necessarily coming from the federal government, and over time they figured out what worked. And when I came back into government in 2017, it was the thing that everybody loved to hate. Republicans thought that it was based on pseudoscience and that it didn't work. And Democrats thought it was a tool to target the Muslim community. And we were kind of left, when you're new in a job, trying to figure out what's the ground truth here. We had some extra money, so we punted. We asked RAND, our FFRDC, to study it for us. They produced a 300-page report. They talked to experts all around the world and other countries who have been doing prevention. Sorry, sir. The bottom line is, I think what we have produced now learns from the mistakes that we made and is based on evidence that it does work. That said, I've been very clear, and when I briefed you guys 2 years ago, we're trying something new, we're innovating, because what we have tried for 20 years hasn't worked. So we're going to make mistakes. We need to be transparent about those mistakes. We need civil libertarians at the table helping us do this. Two main differences from the past: it is not law enforcement led, and it's locally based. It's not driven out of Washington.
Okay, well, thank you. And I know this is a complicated area, and I don't mean to rush the discussion, but I'm getting close to the end of my time. You quoted Ben Franklin earlier. Afterwards, Mr. Levin quoted Abraham Lincoln. But Franklin's admonition is correct. I hope everybody agrees with that prevention is the best approach here if it would work. In other words, trying to avoid these hateful acts, avoid what's happening online, as we talked about earlier, through prevention. And what you're saying is it's the social science around that has been difficult. And you say the RAND study validates the fact that this prevention effort was somewhat successful, but it could be more successful if you use different kinds of tools, including different kinds of leadership and different roles for law enforcement. But I think prevention is absolutely critical, and we have to figure this out. And again, this is a committee that's supposed to be providing the oversight over not just that program, but the entire department's effort in this realm, and we have the lead on it in the Department of Homeland Security. So I really want to work with the people on this panel today and with the chairman and others to be sure that we have an effective prevention program. We've talked about the international terrorism issue more than we had the domestic terrorism issue relative to prevention, but obviously both are incredibly important. And I think to Ms. Berry's point, it can be money very well spent if it's spent effectively. And by the way, to the law enforcement point, and again, I want to hear Mr. Levin later. I guess you'll have to get it for the record now because I'm over my time. Give me your data on law enforcement and government officials generally being subject to these attacks, because the data we have from Tuesday is that the single highest number of attacks are actually on government officials and law enforcement. So it's a broad issue, and I just end with one final point. In the Somali community in Columbus, Ohio, law enforcement developed a good relationship, and particularly one officer, and they were able, as a result, to prevent an attack from happening. I mean, literally, someone had the steps in place to initiate a terrible attack that would have killed a number of people. And because of a tip and because of working with the Somali community, the community stepped forward. Obviously, the leaders in the community were adamant about not having this kind of activity, certainly terrorist activity, in their midst. And so they worked with law enforcement to provide the information. It's one of the few examples we can point to in America where we actually know that law enforcement worked with the community responded, and we were able to avert a terrible attack. So I do think law enforcement can play a very effective role at the local level in an appropriate way, in this case by developing those relationships. And I think that may be one of the single most important effective things that we can do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Portman. Senator Hassan, you are recognized for your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member Portman, for your leadership in holding this hearing, and to all of our witnesses today. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you for your testimony today. I want to start with a question to you, Ms. Neumann. The testimony we've heard this week illustrates the clear threat posed by different types of domestic terrorist movements. However, we can't lose sight of international terrorist threats, and I want to ensure that DHS has the personnel and resources needed to address both types of threats. So based on your time with the Department of Homeland Security, how should the department think about resource allocation to ensure that it is positioned to analyze and confront all types of evolving threats, including threats from domestic terrorists, foreign terrorist organizations, and homegrown violent extremists?
Thank you for the question, Senator. That was certainly a struggle for us in the past three years that I served during the Trump administration. But let me break the question down into two areas. There's the work that we do at DHS that is about empowering our partners, helping our partners, usually state and local governments, private sector, to perform their preparedness function missions. So that's prevention, protection, response, recovery. We give grant funds for that. We set baseline capabilities for that. And I spent most of my comments talking about prevention today because that was really a weak area when we look at the preparedness space. It's so much less mature than the other mission areas. When it comes to prevention and protection, the way DHS looks at it is capability-based. It's not based on ideology. So if you establish a local prevention capability in a state or in a city, regardless of the ideology, it will serve whatever tomorrow's threat might be, because we know enough about how people why people go to commit violent acts. There's now 30, 40 years of studies on people that conduct these mass attacks, that we can make sure that we provide services to help people before they cross that criminal threshold. It's not ideology based. That said, I would say one of the biggest gaps at DHS has been on the intelligence side, and it's still not clear to me who in the federal government is responsible for producing a strategic threat picture as it pertains to domestic terrorism. On the foreign terrorism side, you made it very clear that Congress passed a law, and the National Counterterrorism Center is responsible for collating and producing those national strategic threat pictures.
Right.
Nobody could do that when I was in government for the domestic terrorism space, and NCTC does not currently have the authorities to work on that type of picture. So it is either the FBI or DHS, and I'm not sure that either one of them is able to do that today, in part because of a lack of data.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much, and we will follow up with you, I think, with some additional questions. I want to turn to Mr. Greenblatt now. I want to thank you, Mr. Greenblatt, for the Anti-Defamation League's support for the Pray Safe Act, bipartisan legislation that Senator Portman and I introduced, and that, as he mentioned, this committee passed last month. As we work to pass this bill in the full Senate, could you please elaborate on the unique need for a clearinghouse specifically for faith-based organizations and houses of worship?
Thank you very much for the question, Senator Hassan. First of all, I would just say we think the Pray Safe Act is incredibly important. The idea that it would create a best practices portal for faith-based organizations from all religions that would benefit from DHS's understanding of security protocols that they could take on themselves, what's worked for other organizations in terms of best practices, and how they can apply for federal grants. We know that this issue in particular is a big problem. The Nonprofit Security Grants Program, which we would like to see dramatically increased, still is underutilized by the vast majority of houses of worship and faith-based organizations. Getting more of them to apply and access the program is critical. You know, as mentioned in my opening remarks, today is the anniversary of the attack on the Sikh Gurdwara, right? We know that the Nonprofit Security Grants Program is not utilized by many religious denominations, despite the attacks on mosques, Gurdwaras, black churches, as well as synagogues. So more needs to be done, and we believe that the Pray Safe Act is an important step in that process. We worked actively, not just with synagogues, I would say, but also with mosques and Islamic centers to help them understand what resources are available to them, but much more needs to be done.
Well, I appreciate that. Are there specific steps that you think FEMA could take to make the application process for the grants in the Nonprofit Security Grant Program more accessible to houses of worship and faith-based organizations?
Well, first and foremost, it starts with more effective outreach. We need to be able to let these organizations and these communities understand and know what's available to them. And I think FEMA and DHS in general can do a better job of reaching out to faith-based communities to make them aware. So I would start there. I would also say, very important, we need to think about that outreach in multiple languages, because again, there can be cultural barriers as communities are not familiar with, or maybe even uncomfortable in working with the federal government. Language-focused outreach can help overcome some of those cultural impediments.
Thank you. I want to turn now to the issue of online disinformation and radicalization, Mr. Greenblatt. Individuals involved in domestic terrorism are frequently involved in the consumption and propagation of extremist content and disinformation online. So, Mr. Greenblatt, in your view, what role can the federal government play when it comes to combating online extremist content and disinformation while also protecting First Amendment liberties?
Well, thank you very much for the question. In the time remaining, I'll try to be brief. So, you know, the ADL, we've been defending the First Amendment for over 100 years. Yep. We take freedom of speech very seriously, but the freedom of speech is not the freedom to slander, nor is the freedom of expression the freedom to incite violence. So first and foremost, we think it is crucial that the federal government look at Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which literally exempts the social media companies from any responsibility, from any accountability for the content that they publish. Senator, there is literally no other sector of business which benefits from this broad immunity for its very products and services. It is high time for this Congress to look very seriously at dramatic and deep reform of Section 230, because these companies, from the algorithmic amplification of hate because it drives clicks, to monetizing that content because it drives revenue, none of that should be acceptable. And I don't think it is to Republicans or Democrats, liberals or conservatives. Section 230 needs a serious overhaul, and you can lead on that process.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I appreciate all of our witnesses and your testimony today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Hassan. The chair recognizes Senator Rosen for your questions.
Well, thank you, Chairman Peters and Ranking Member Portman, for holding this important hearing, of course, and so many others. As co-chair of the Senate Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism, I really want to welcome my friend Jonathan Greenblatt from ADL, and of course, all the witnesses here today, Maya Berry, Elizabeth Neumann, and Brian Levin, and thank you for being here today, for the work that you do, and for the thoughtful testimony that you have given so far. And Mr. Chairman, I'd also like to ask for unanimous consent that Radicalization Exodus, this is a recently published report on white supremacists, use of Holocaust denial, and how they do that. It's authored by the American Jewish Congress. I'd like to have that entered into the record, if I may.
Without objection.
And I'll also like to thank Senators Hassan and Portman for the Pray Safe Act. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor. We need to do that. We need to bolster up our nonprofit Homeland Security grants, all of that. And as I mentioned, I am co-chair of the Senate Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism, which my HISGAC colleague, Senator Langford, and I co-founded in 2019. And I don't have to tell anyone here how alarmed I am, and I know we all are, at statistics that show that anti-Semitic hate crimes in the United States are at the highest level in recorded history. In May 2021 alone, ADL recorded 251 anti-Semitic incidents. That's a 115% jump. And might I say, that's only the ones that were reported. I'm sure there are many that weren't reported. It's nothing new. Anti-Semitism, nothing new. It's a canary in the coal mine of hatred for thousands of years. It doesn't only affect Jews, and it doesn't, it just affects everybody, all Americans, particularly underrepresented minorities. And history teaches us that when the flames of anti-Semitism spread, democracy itself is set ablaze. So, Mr. Greenblatt, could you explain why anti-Semitism, it just doesn't pose a danger to Jews, but to all Americans?
Well, thank you very much, Madam Senator, for the question, and I would really salute you for your leadership on the caucus and the task force on anti-Semitism. Look, I think anti-Semitism is a bit of a barometric reading on society. It's often described, as you said, as the canary in the coal mine. Sometimes it's called the oldest hatred. But as Emory Professor Deborah Lipstadt has written, and I'll note that she's recently been nominated by the White House to be the next special envoy for global anti-Semitism, State Department. Anti-Semitism starts with the Jews, but it never ends with the Jews. It may be the conspiracy that is at the beating heart of white supremacy, but from that springs forth a series of other forms of intolerance, right? We mentioned earlier the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue. While that was perpetrated against that shul, the reality was it was an attack really motivated by a hatred of immigrants, because this individual, the shooter, whose name I won't dignify by mentioning, believed that a cabal of Jews was plotting to overrun the United States with Muslims and immigrants from other countries. So from anti-immigrant hatred to anti-Muslim bias to anti-Black racism, literally all of it can be often connected to anti-Jewish hate. And appreciating the intersectional nature of all these forms of oppression means we should be committed to fighting all of them with intensity and vigor. We do that work at ADL. I know a number of my colleagues do that work as well, and I think it's just incredibly important.
Well, thank you for that. I'm glad to have founded with Senators Tim Scott and Cory Booker the new task force on Black-Jewish relations. Of course, we signed the anti-Asian hate crimes bill in, and you're right, we have to be working on this on all fronts. And I'd like to build on what some of my colleagues have talked about in online radicalization. These tools of extremism, the theories, the disinformation, we know that they're beginning and spreading quickly online. They just can morph overnight, right? And so I'm relieved to see, like we spoke, companies like Facebook and Twitter taking some long overdue steps to curb the rise of hate, like prohibiting Holocaust denial content. However, we're seeing extremism resurface on alternative social media platforms like Gab, which we know is a recruitment tool for neo-Nazis and was the website where we mentioned the Tree of Life synagogue shooter posted right before that massacre. So, Mr. Greenblatt, again, all too often what enables extremist groups and individuals is the hate messaging to the American public and the algorithms, like you said, that are in social media. So what specific steps do you think platforms should take to ensure that the hateful content does not escalate to violence? And what checks should we put in place to ensure that this violence isn't celebrated and amplified on these platforms?
Well, first and foremost, thank you very much for the question. I mentioned Section 230 reform. It's really critical. We need to do it in such a way that protects the targets of harassment and has transparency, push the companies for independent audits. And we really need to deal with the overall problematic business model, Senator, and the anti-competitive marketplace that we have. So you mentioned alternative platforms. There's Gab and there's Discord and there's Getter and Parler is trying to reemerge, et cetera. But let's be clear. Facebook is literally a $1 trillion corporation that earned $80 billion in revenue last year, $24 billion in profit. They have more users than any country on the planet has citizens. This is one of the most innovative businesses in the history of capitalism. They, if they chose to, could apply their resources to solve this problem tomorrow. It simply requires them enforcing their own terms of service. But the reason why ADL, along with the NAACP, Color of Change, LULAC, Common Sense Media, and others launched the Stop Hate for Profit campaign last year was the company's failure to deal with anti-Black racism, anti-Semitism, and other forms of hate on the platform. It was only when they came under severe reputational pressure that the company finally made a series of concessions. So I can't understate enough the power that you have, because while they may be immune from revenue pressure because of their size and fiduciary pressure because of their governance, these companies are not immune to reputational pressure and regulatory pressure. So it is Facebook that is first and foremost, and our own studies show us that 3 times the number of people who are literally targeted and harassed online, it happens on Facebook more than anywhere else. But again, TikTok and Twitter, Clubhouse and Google and so many of these other companies, they all have challenges and they all merit our attention.
Well, thank you. Like I said, I appreciate the work that ADL does, that everyone here on the panel, the panels that we've had in the past, everything you all are doing to make sure that we have all the information that we need here in Washington to partner with our communities all across this country and across the globe to do the right thing to stop hate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time's up.
Thank you, Senator Hassan. Ms. Neumann, you said here today that you're seeing threads of acceleration enter mainstream political discourse. So I'm curious about that and your thoughts on that. Could you give me an example and explain why you think this is so harmful and why it's so dangerous and we need to pay particular attention to?
Sure. Accelerationism is mostly associated with white supremacist ideology, though it is really more of a doctrine that could apply to any ideology, and increasingly we are seeing other ideologies pick it up. And this basic idea that whatever your goal is, the best way to get there is to usher societal collapse so that you can maybe it's a race war or a civil war, just make everything break down so that on the other side you can rebirth or have this utopia and make it the way you want it to be. So if you're a white supremacist, you want it to be a white nation state, not the United States, but a white nation in the territory of what we call the United States. But there are other anarchist Boogaloo Boys, which is I'll defer to my one of your panelists at CSIS from Tuesday, Seth Jones, talks about some of these groups that hold to this accelerationist ideology, Boogaloo Boys being one of them. They're not easily categorized. There are experts that call these extremists fluid. They pick and choose the ideology that they are looking for. So it makes it hard, and I think Mr. Levin even referred to this, the democratization of extremist ideology, it makes it hard because we want to bucket individuals. We want to be able to say, like, the white supremacists believe this, and the anarchists believe this, and the anti-government extremists believe that. I think the thing that I find concerning about the fluidity between these groups and the fact that this accelerationist doctrine is starting to pop up is that it creates a lot of volatility for exactly what Mr. Levin was describing. It just takes one catalyst, and then you have this social media feedback loop, and perhaps one or two leaders kind of sanctioning whatever that catalyst and the response was to lead us to a moment where a mass group of people show up and believe that violence is justified to achieve their ends. And you're hearing in political discourse, regularly on cable news, conversations that imply that, yeah, we might need to take up arms. There have been a number of polls done in the last 6 months, and there's a significant percentage of people in the country at this point that believe that a civil war is likely to happen, and that maybe we need to help it happen sooner. Those are very concerning themes that are being discussed in certain parts of our country, and I think it's complex. When you dig underneath why people feel like a civil war is coming or why they feel like violence might be justified, some of it is based on different understandings of what facts are. There are people, in my opinion, that are believing a series of lies about the election in November, and if you believe that the election was stolen from you, there is a logic trail of why you might think that violence is justified. So it's really incumbent that we go back to what actual facts are. And this is not to say that we will have a problem with violent extremists for, I believe, at least the next generation based on where we are today. But the biggest problem that we have in this particular moment is that it's the traditional violent extremists and a mass political movement that is talking about how violence might be justified in certain circumstances. Those numbers, when you start looking at those percentages, we're talking millions of people. We do not have enough security forces. We don't have enough money to hire security forces to de-escalate if a group of people in a political context decide they want to take up arms. So the only thing I know to do is to call upon all of us in society to check ourselves. How are we contributing to that dynamic? What can we do to try to de-escalate some of the tension? Now, it in my view, is a bit better than it was 3 months ago, and certainly better than it was 6 months ago. But I don't think we're out of the woods yet. And if there's a way to convince the media, the tech companies, and elected officials to take this threat seriously, that your words, as Mr. Levin pointed out, there is strong research now. It is not somebody's opinion. There is research that directly shows when people with a platform say certain things, hate crimes go up. That means people get hurt physically in the real world when somebody says something virtually. And those that have larger platforms bear more responsibility. Yes, you have a First Amendment, but I would hope that anybody that swears an oath to the Constitution or decides that they are going to take on a larger platform recognizes they have a responsibility to first do no harm. And we need to treat this seriously and be careful with the words that we choose to use on the platforms that we have.
Thank you, Ms. Neumann. As I heard your answer, other panelists were shaking their heads, so I believe others would like to weigh in as well. So I'm going to open it up to our other panelists, anyone who would like to weigh in. I know, Mr. Levin, you were definitely shaking your head related to some of the data associated with this. What are your thoughts?
Thank you. That is my thought. 2014, I did a TED Talk about the disinformation online at a time when Facebook was considered the be-all and end-all of all things good. We have seen, and we put it in our appendices, Dr. James Nolan and Andrew Thompson, myself, Kevin Grisham, John Reitzel, we put these things together, and what we did was we overlaid, listen to this, we overlaid invective that was online. I don't want to say the words because I have my son here, but the invective online, in that time 4chan, and hate crime into the election. It became one line. Facebook, also, where wonderful things can happen when we're interconnected. But guess what else? We put out a conflict advisory on April 17th when we saw liberate groups go throughout the country. And I stopped counting at 200. Devin Berghardt, a wonderful researcher, found that by the time it was booted off of Facebook, which they did do, there were just under 3 million people. QAnon, Boogaloo Boys, Civil Guard, they all had a decent presence on Facebook. So the bottom line is, you know, if I develop something where I said that Jews are biologically inferior, or that drinking mercury was a health salve, no one would listen to me. But today on social media, you can have people connected across, and we are seeing that. In California, just real briefly, in California, we are looking to do two things, and I don't mean to insult the wonderful folks who invited me, but the legislature in California is thinking, hey, our national government isn't doing the job. So a couple of things we're looking at. Creating a state of hate commission, Assemblymember Bloom. What else? With regard to specifically the online space, AB 587, where the tech companies, these social media platforms, would at least come out with every year, annually, a report telling us what their terms of service are and what they're doing to make sure this stuff is being enforced. So the bottom line is we're at the point now where these platforms really affect things. One last point that's really important. Extremists are on multiple platforms. Up until recently, a Holocaust denier was making over 60 grand on DLive. So we're seeing a cascade from larger platforms to more affinity-based encrypted platforms. And additionally, as Ms. Neumann said, we are now seeing almost an idiosyncratic a la carte type of extremism, where sometimes we can say, okay, we know where this is coming from, and other times it's mixed. We have a category called mixed. And the bottom line is social media is a big problem with this, and particularly a $1 trillion company like Facebook needs to do more. It's whack-a-mole. It seems to me that they do a good job after the horses have left the barn.
Thank you. Any other panelists?
Mr. Chairman, I would offer, listening to Ms. Newman's comment about the threat to our democracy by actors who have chosen that violence is a legitimate route. I was reminded of the recent Max Weber, I recently read a Max Weber quote about government being the sole source of legitimate violence. This is what's happening here, which is that there are parties who have decided that that's not the case, and they are choosing to take on the kind of societal fiber that keeps it together. We saw this on January 6th, and before January 6th, we saw it in the data that Mr. Levin has been citing. The very vulnerable communities have been targeted by hate. We see it in terms of the surge we've seen in anti-Semitism, anti-Black hate crime. So the data is there, and it shows that. And I think that is absolutely something to think about. I do want I want to read this one quote, and then I think it comes from the perspective that we bring to these conversations. In our country, espousing an extremist ideology is not a crime, nor is it expressing hateful views or associating with hateful groups. That was Attorney General Merrick Garland in his testimony before Congress. I think the focus ought to remain on the violence and not the ideology. I understand why those who want to engage in prevention programs and address this idea of a theory of radicalization and off-ramping people, I know why that comes into the conversation, but the focus has to be on the violence that is literally tearing our country apart.
Thank you. Mr. Greenblatt, I'm going to ask you to weigh in, but I'm going to ask you to hold off on that just a moment because we have Senator Ossoff who is up. And Senator Ossoff, I'd like to recognize you for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this hearing. Thank you to our panel for your contributions. Ms. Berry, I've been refreshed to hear the caution that you've advised. in rushing to implement policies with potentially profound implications for civil liberties without having thought through the implications with great care. And reflecting on the post-9/11 dynamics you referred, the mass rapid growth of domestic surveillance, very intrusive and very broad monitoring of mosques and Muslim communities. We've focused much of this discussion on whether additional charging authorities are prudent or necessary, but what are your concerns regarding other proposed increases in counterterrorism policing authorities, investigative authorities? And I'd like you to also weigh in, Ms. Neumann, you suggested, I thought it was a great suggestion, that there be some more formal review of those post-9/11 policies in order to draw lessons that can be applied as we consider policy today. I'd like for you both, please, to weigh in on how we might structure that kind of thing.
Thank you so much, Senator, for your comments and your question. Even during our hearing today, part of the conversation when we were talking about this would suggest that my community is a partner in the war on terror, right? We are not a partner in the war on terror. We're not the front line of counterterrorism policies. We're a community that have been targeted by hate crimes. We're a community that has been targeted by government policies that have had a disparate impact on us. If we see a crime, we report it because we want to be safe. We want our children to be safe. That goes without question. That's not different in any other way. In terms of the oversight piece 2 decades later, I think one of the most important pieces, I was a congressional staffer on 9/11. And I was in the room because I worked for a member of the Democratic leadership, Congressman David Bonnier. I was in the room when the then Attorney General John Ashcroft brought up the Patriot Act. And I know that it passed. Members have admitted it passed without a full reading. And the idea was that we would put in sunset provisions and revisit those and look at what kind of impact that they've had. Regrettably, when we talk about these issues through a national security frame, it suspends our ability to understand and process the civil rights and civil liberties concerns. It's regrettable that that takes place, but that is what takes place. And historically, it's been Arab Americans or American Muslims. More recently, we've seen the Asian American community being subjected to some pretty unfortunate national security discriminatory policies as well. It expands the South Asian community. So I think it's imperative that we one of the recommendations I mentioned specifically in terms of Department of Homeland Security oversight that your committee has, that we look at requiring a mapping program of the type of data that the Department of Homeland Security collects on all of us. How does it retain it? Who does it share it with? What does it do with it? We don't know that information. And I think it's critical if we're going to have community trust. I mean, the reason we have to take a skeptical approach to all of this is because of the practices and the abuses that our community has seen. So we have to do better to keep all of us safe, and that requires trust in government. We don't have that for good reason. The oversight that you all can provide is a critical piece of that.
Thank you, Ms. Berry. And Ms. Neumann, if you might concisely on what such a review of those policies might look like, with due respect, just want to make sure I can get a question to Mr. Levin as well.
Of course. It was in February 2020, I was testifying over on the House, and I actually called for a bipartisan commission to look at both the past as well as what do we need to do about domestic terrorism. So it was before the present experience that we've all gone through of January 6th and quite frankly, the spike that we kind of knew was coming, but COVID hadn't happened yet. We didn't know how bad it was going to get. But part of the reason I called for that is because we could see, to borrow the phrase, the system blinking red, and we could see that the current structure of the authorities impeded our ability to go after the threat with equal measure. And there was I believe, a bill that was put into the NDAA and made it all the way to, my understanding, that December conversation where you're trying to get things out the door, and then it was removed from the bill, so it did not pass, and I believe that was unfortunate. I had hopes that the January 6th Commission might be able to do something similar. It looks like we're not going to have a January 6th Commission, so I still think it would be wise. This is extremely complex, as Ms. Berry has pointed out. You need experts from the intelligence community, from the operators that do counterterrorism. You need experts from communities that have been on the receiving end of the effects of these policies. It is nobody in the executive branch ever has enough time to be thoughtful and to dig into all of the whys. A lot of things are under-resourced, and that's part of the reason you don't see transparency, because nobody has time to be able to be transparent. So there are absolutely, in my view, without getting into anything classified, ways in which we could improve the way the government functions on the international terrorism side. And I think we fundamentally need to fix that, because clearly we have lost the trust of our citizens. And then maybe that gives us an opportunity to also look at how do we right-size and deal with the domestic terrorism measures as well.
Thank you, Ms. Neumann. And Mr. Levin, you've spent some of your testimony today and answered questions about underlying factors, the conditions that have emerged that have increased the level of threat, both of hate crimes and violence that may be committed by domestic violent extremists. And we've talked about social media, and social media is often discussed. Is social media really more of an accelerant and a vector, or do you see it as a cause? And given that we've seen these dynamics emerge simultaneously in Europe and in North America, what, in your view, are the underlying social and political and cultural conditions that are driving radicalization and sectarianism in diverse societies that in which we can only flourish and coexist when we cohere?
Excellent question. Thank you so much, Senator. First, I do not believe that we need a new broadly applicable domestic terrorism law. Just want to go on the record with that. We can improve certain things, and I'm going to tie it to your question. For instance, 18 U.S. Code 231 et sequence punishes only trainers in violent skills to foment a civil disorder, but not trainees. In your home state, Atlanta counted one hate crime in 2019, and the head of the Klan in Maryland and Delaware just started a militia in your state, and he's taken photographs of people running for office. And what we have seen is a broad reservoir of grievance. And what social media does, I think it's a combination of cause and accelerant. Let me tell you what I mean. Pew has found we are the most polarized we've been in decades, and now we're seeing other surveys showing we're even fragmented within that polarization. And what happens, what social media allows, is these subcultures. So you have this big grievance, whatever it is, and it ends up going to the lowest common denominator. So for instance, people who were in favor of gun rights, nothing wrong with that. But what is created is a category of villains who are demonized within a subculture, and then you have that cascade down to people who not only believe I have a right to own a firearm if I'm a law-abiding citizen, to one that says the insurrectionist doctrine of the Second Amendment, which even Scalia in Heller said is not good, which says that I have the right to armed rebellion with those weapons. And what happens is you see these bubbles that start off, and it might be a person in a community or a county or a region, and he'd get no support, or she would get no support. But online, these big social media platforms allow it, and then it cascades down. And we need to have some serious recognition about the role of social media, and I think at the very least, I think we all can agree upon, if they put up certain requirements for themselves, I think they need to report on it annually, as our Bill 587 says in California. How are they doing? Another thing, transparency. Facebook just this week said, cut off NYU from doing research. You know what? If you want to use the information superhighway that was created by our tax dollars, you better make sure that you're applying the rules of the road. So I think it's both a cause and an accelerant, particularly because, one last point, the declining trust in the communal institutions that hold us together. My son did a beautiful chart that's in the appendices about all that going down, and guess what? Congress is at the lowest.
On that note, I yield.
I didn't mean that rudely. My mom wants me to be civil.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff, for your questions. Mr. Greenblatt, I want to go back to you to give you an opportunity to weigh in on the discussion that we had prior to Senator Ossoff's questions on what we're seeing in terms of acceleration. But I also wanted to ask you about data, and the ADL does a fabulous job in collecting data. You know, I introduced legislation that was signed into law requiring the FBI, the DHS, and the ODNI to track and publicly report data related to domestic terrorism, and unfortunately, their response is late and woefully inadequate. So I'd also, in addition to your thoughts on the previous discussion, if you could speak to the importance of having the federal government capture comprehensive and reliable data on domestic terrorism. I'd appreciate if you could handle or tackle both of those questions, please.
Sure. So why don't I start with the question as it relates to, again, social media? And I think there are just a couple things. I've talked about this already. There are just a couple things to note. I think first and foremost, the First Amendment, as we've talked about it, doesn't apply to commercial environments. There's plenty of precedent in Supreme Court decisions which make that very clear. Even that being said, in public spaces, states and state-controlled spaces, all speech isn't permitted. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. As I said before, slander, incitement to violence, that's not permitted. All that being said, we need to be willing to tolerate hateful speech online, but the trick is to keep fringe ideas on the fringe and not to elevate them algorithmically, not to monetize them with advertising, and to take down threats to persons based on their sexual orientation or their faith or their religion or their gender. ADL released a report card literally last week that noted the failure of the big tech companies to do this consistently and in a timely manner. And it's absolutely untenable. One of the steps that I think we could see that Congress could take would be the creation of a clearinghouse, a bit like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, an independent clearinghouse where extremist content could be stored, if you will, so that the companies, when we see extremists, and it's already been mentioned by my fellow panelists, they move from platform to platform to platform. We can better manage that threat and mitigate it. If we had an independent clearinghouse was collecting this data, so it's all being shared. I would also just say, to the issue of transparency that Professor Levin just mentioned, the failure of the companies, we'll talk about the government in a minute, but the failure of the companies, particularly Facebook, to provide any transparency into their data is unconscionable. No other industry, literally no other industry, behaves this way. And we don't even know about the content that gets taken down. There is no independent verification of their data. So organizations like mine and others are unable to track it effectively. So this is just a very big problem. I would say specifically as it relates to data on domestic terror and violent extremism, indeed, we need the federal government to be more forthright and to see coordination from the agencies, the likes of which you mentioned, Senator Peter, in sharing data about acts of domestic terrorism and violent extremism. There are academic centers like Professor Levin's at UCSB, and there are organizations like ADL and the SPLC and others that try to collect this information. What we have done is created tools, like on our website, you can see the ADL HEAT map, which stands for Hate, Extremism, Anti-Semitism, and Terror. And we're using data visualization to make it easier for individuals and scholars and journalists and experts and ultimately policymakers to understand the patterns of extremist activity and hate crime so you can drive better policy. But we would be so well served if the ODNI and DHS and the FBI would do more to make it easier for us to understand the threat. And I think some of the content, Senator Peters, in the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act literally tries to get at this problem.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And I want to take this opportunity just to thank all of our witnesses for joining us here today, for providing us your expertise. I will say that your testimony has been both alarming but clearly essential for us to hear, and we need to be focused on this issue. And it's my commitment, and I think members of the committee here, that we will continue to be focused on this issue in the months and years ahead. Both of this week's hearings have contributed pertinent information for our committee to better understand what needs to be done to combat this most lethal and serious national security threat. I look forward to continuing to examine terrorism threat and the actions that need to be taken to ensure that we have a comprehensive and enduring counterterrorism policy that effectively takes on white supremacists, anti-government, and anti-Semitic violence here in the United States. That effort will continue, as I mentioned earlier, in September with our annual threats hearing before this committee. I will note that the record for this hearing will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on August 20th of 2021 for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is now adjourned.